That completes the urgent question. We're now going to come to the statement. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will update the House on the situation in Israel and Gaza. Last week, my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, visited the region as part of sustained British efforts to end the fighting and build towards a lasting solution. This statement, Mr. Speaker, will also cover the International Court of Justice's decision on provisional measures and the appalling allegations against the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian refugees. As we debate these events, I know the whole House shares my horror at the heart-wrenching impact of this conflict. 114 days on from Hamas's barbaric attacks, they still hold more than 130 hostages, and innocent Palestinians are suffering, with over 25,000 people having died and hunger and disease spreading. Mr. Speaker, the government's end goal is clear. Israelis should be able to live without fear of Hamas terrorism, and Gazans be able to rebuild their lives. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has led our engagement in the region and with partners to achieve that goal. Last week, he spoke to President Biden and met families of hostages, while my noble friend Lord Ahmed joined a Security Council debate in New York. And the Foreign Secretary visited Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, Qatar and Turkey, meeting leaders, ministers and other hostage families. The Foreign Secretary called for an immediate pause to get more aid in and get hostages out, and for this pause then to turn into a sustainable permanent ceasefire without a return to fighting. The British government has identified 5 vital steps for this to happen. A political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. Forming a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package. Removing Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel. The release of all Israeli hostages and the key Hamas leaders agreeing to leave Gaza. All of these things are intricately linked. We cannot secure one without all of the others. There are also many other elements, Mr. Speaker, to consider, such as Arab-Israeli normalisation, security guarantees, financing the rebuilding of Gaza. But we need to generate momentum now towards a permanent peace. And that is why pushing for a pause now is so important. And that is why we need a contact group meeting bringing together the key players as soon as possible. Mr. Speaker, I turn now to the desperate humanitarian situation. The government is focused on practical solutions to get aid into Gaza. We have trebled our aid to the occupied Palestinian territories since October the 7th, committing £60 million this financial year. In Israel, the Foreign Secretary pressed for changes to allow unhindered humanitarian access, such as opening more crossing points for longer and permitting deliveries via Ashdod port. He announced work with Qatar to get more aid into Gaza, with our joint consignment containing 17 tonnes of family-sized tents being flown last Thursday. Earlier this month, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Lyme Bay delivered 87 tonnes of aid into Port Said. Crucially, we are supporting the United Nations World Food Programme to deliver a new humanitarian land corridor from Jordan into Gaza, which has already delivered over 1,000 tonnes of aid into Gaza. We know, Mr. Speaker, that the desperate plight of civilians caught up in this, the suffering they are going through. We will continue to do all we can with our partners to save lives. Mr. Speaker, I will now turn to the ICJ ruling and allegations against UNRWA. Honourable and right honourable members will know we had considerable concerns about South Africa's decision to bring this case. Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas, and we do not believe Israel's actions in Gaza can be described as a genocide. Of course, we respect the role and independence of the ICJ. The court has now reached a decision on provisional measures. They called for increased aid into Gaza and measures to ensure basic services, as we have been calling for. They have ordered Israel to preserve evidence relating to allegations of genocide, reporting to the court on progress within 1 month. They have also ordered the immediate release of all hostages and reminded all parties to the conflict that they are bound by international humanitarian law. These are points we, Mr. Speaker, have been pressing consistently, and we will continue to press them after the court's decision. For our part, Britain continues to engage closely with the Israeli government on the conduct of its military campaign in Gaza. We have said they must take greater care to avoid harming civilians and civilian infrastructure. Let me turn finally, Mr. Speaker, to the very serious allegations about UNRWA, first publicised last week, with further media reporting over the weekend. The agency is critical to delivering humanitarian assistance into Gaza and across the region. It plays a stabilising role at a time when we need focus on de-escalating tensions. The UK is a long-standing donor to UNRWA, as are our closest partners, notably the United States. Since October the 7th, we have allocated a further £16 million to them as part of our response to the crisis. UNRWA's 13,000 staff in Gaza continue their work at great personal risk in the most dangerous circumstances. 152 UNRWA staff members have lost their lives. The UK is, however, appalled by allegations that any agency staff were involved in the October the 7th atrocities. We welcome the swift action UNRWA have taken to terminate contracts while it launches an immediate investigation. We and several partners are temporarily pausing future funding until we have reviewed these investigations. We continue to fund vital aid delivery through multiple other partners, including other UN agencies and international and British NGOs. Mr. Speaker, this week the government engagement continues. The Foreign Secretary and Lord Ahmed will again travel to the region. I am travelling to Qatar next week. We will continue to drive progress towards a lasting solution. As the government has said, it is only when the prize of peace is more attractive than the potential benefit of continued conflict that there will be the chance of a better future. The time to start is now. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. Last week, the International Court of Justice made an interim ruling under the Genocide Convention on the situation in Gaza. It was profoundly serious. The ICJ's interim ruling does not give a verdict on the case, but it sets out urgent provisional measures. Labour has been clear. Israel must comply with the orders in this ruling in full, and Hamas terrorists must release all the hostages immediately. But I note that the missing Foreign Secretary made no statement. The only response that appeared was from a nameless spokesperson the day after the judgment. It claimed the government respects the role of the independence of the ICJ, but stated considerable concerns about this case. Can the Minister give me a clear answer? Does the government accept the court's authority or not? Does it believe the ruling should be implemented in full or not? If not, which orders does it disagree with? While the government prevaricates, Labour is clear. International law must be upheld. The independence of international courts must be respected, and all sides must be accountable for their actions. This is why we will press for all these orders to be implemented alongside an immediate humanitarian truce and a sustainable ceasefire. The dire situation in Gaza must not continue. Can the Minister update the House on the progress of negotiations to secure a truce that will lead to civilians being protected, all hostages released immediately, and a humanitarian surge in Gaza? I repeat, aid getting into Gaza must surge, not stop. The allegations that a number of UNRWA employees were involved in the appalling October 7th terror attacks appalled this whole House. Anyone involved should be held to account by the force of the law. It is right that UNRWA have responded quickly by terminating contracts of staff allegedly involved and launching an investigation. Meanwhile, though, the humanitarian emergency in Gaza cannot wait. 25,000 people dead, including thousands of women and children. 85% of the population displaced, millions facing the risk of famine. Can the Minister confirm that existing UK aid will continue to flow into Gaza so that current operations can continue? And will the Minister outline a clear and fast path for future funding to return? We cannot let innocent Palestinians lose life-saving aid because of Hamas terrorists. Meanwhile, there continues to be a dangerous escalation across the Middle East. We totally deplore the attacks on US soldiers. We offer our deep sympathies to those who have lost their lives and have been injured in this attack, as well as to their families. We stand with our US allies at this time of grief. These attacks are totally unjustifiable and raise tensions at an already dangerous time in the region. Iran must cease these attacks and de-escalate immediately. Labour has long recognised the dangers posed by Iran and its proxies. We've supported sanctions against Iran, and we have said for more than a year that in government Labour would prescribe the IRGC, even though existing processes or either through existing processes or a new mechanism to tackle hostile state actors. What will it take for the government to finally act? And finally, on behalf of our brave military families who sacrifice so much every day to keep us safe, can the Minister outline what his government is doing to boost protection for the 2,500 troops stationed across the Middle East? Mr. Speaker, I welcome the government's efforts towards a permanent peace. The situation in the Middle East cannot be more serious. But I'm afraid I have to note that the Development Minister opposite, as capable as he is, and he is capable, is not the main decision-maker in the Foreign Office. When will the Foreign Secretary finally come to this House to answer questions at this most dangerous of times?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary for his comments, and let me try and address all of them. Can I start by thanking him for his comment about British troops who are deployed in the region, in particular our naval assets, which have been in the front line in recent weeks and days. I agree with him that their safety is a paramount duty of the government, and he may rest assured that we take that extremely seriously. Secondly, he asks about my right honourable and noble friend, the Foreign Secretary. He will have seen that over the last week he has taken a leading international role around the region in trying to move these many agendas forward, and in my statement I set out what the Foreign Secretary was doing. And he has made it absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker, that he will be ever present and able to answer questions from members of this House, and he may therefore rest upon that. Thirdly, he mentions the rising tensions in the region and the importance of de-escalating. He asked me once again about the IRGC, and his points are noted, but I cannot comment on that across the floor of the House, as I know he will understand. He talked about the importance of getting aid back into Gaza, and all our efforts are set on that. And he talked about the role of UNRWA. I talked to Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, about 2 hours ago to check that the assets which UNRWA has, without which no aid can get in, the critical UNRWA assets in Gaza, whether it's warehouses or vehicles or stores, are essential for aid delivery, and we all understand that. But he will equally reflect that given the very serious nature of these allegations, it is essential that the government pauses to make sure that this cannot happen again. And finally, on the issue of the ICJ, let me say this. We welcome the Court's call for the immediate release of hostages and the need to get more aid into Gaza. We are clear that an immediate pause is necessary to get the aid in and the hostages out. And on the wider issue he raises, Mr. Speaker, we regularly call on Israel to uphold its obligations under international humanitarian law, and we will continue to do so.
To the Select Committee, Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the update from the Deputy Foreign Secretary about the contact group and progress being made. But I am concerned that in Al-Mawasi, which is a supposed safe zone in Gaza, on the 18th of January, a UK charity, Medical Aid for Palestine and the IRC, had their compound bombed by an airstrike from an F-16 jet. Now, thankfully, the 4 British GPs and doctors who were living there were only injured, although that in itself is a cause for concern. A month before that, on the 22nd December, it was confirmed via UK defence channels that the IDF had logged the coordinates of the humanitarian base and deconflicted it, marking it as a protected site, a sensitive and humanitarian site. I'm gravely concerned, therefore, that this airstrike still took place. So can my right honourable friend please share with the House what investigation is being conducted, what has been the response of the IDF to this, has HMG seen the targeting permissions for that airstrike? Then very briefly on UNRWA, I raised on behalf of the concerns of so many colleagues back in November with UNRWA our concerns about whether or not they were doing enough security checks on their staff. Is the goal of the pausing of aid to essentially force them to get their house in order? Is that what we are trying to achieve? And on the ICJ, the ruling was quite clear that Israel does have a right to self-defence, but that is not limitless. So what is the government doing to ensure that we are fully in line with the ruling and the 6 conditions placed on Israel by the ICJ?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Chairman of the Select Committee for her comments. On the latter point, as I said, we continually remind the Israeli government of its duties under international humanitarian law. On the bombing of the compound to which she referred, this is an extremely serious matter and, as she rightly says, needed to be raised at the highest level. It was raised by the Foreign Secretary in his meetings in Israel last week, and as soon as practical, after the news and the details got out, our ambassador in Tel Aviv raised it as well. On the subject of UNRWA, she rightly, I think, refers to the fact that these assets that UNRWA had, which I described in my response to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, are vital for the delivery of aid. But in terms of the inquiry, this would normally have been carried out by UNRWA. It will not be carried out by UNRWA, but by the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services. They will conduct an immediate inquiry and will report to the Secretary-General on that. And we will obviously look very carefully at what they say.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank the Minister for prior sight of his statement. On Friday, despite concerted efforts to dismiss, ridicule and undermine South Africa's case, the International Court of Justice delivered a damning provisional ruling which ordered Israel to take all measures to prevent acts of genocide in Gaza. This has left the UK government with nowhere to hide, as it now has a legal obligation to protect Palestinian civilians, an obligation which should at the very least mean an immediate arms embargo on Israel. But we all know that the best way to protect civilian lives and to stop the killings and to secure the release of the hostages is with an immediate ceasefire. Mr Speaker, the ICJ ruling also demanded that effective humanitarian assistance be provided to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in Gaza. Instead, the UK government immediately chose to cut funding from UNRWA, one of the few organisations which stands between the people of Gaza and mass starvation. And they did so on the basis of 12 of its 13,000 employees having been accused of taking part in October the 7th's atrocities. Now, if those accusations are true, then it's absolutely right that action is taken against them and they be held to account. But what the UK government has done with its decision to cut funding to UNRWA is to impose their own collective punishment on an already beleaguered and desperate civilian population, knowing with absolute certainty that that decision will result in the deaths of thousands of Palestinian civilians. So could the Minister tell me, what was the thought process that led the Foreign Office to this decision? What cognizance did they take of the ICJ ruling and why did they choose to ignore it? And what assessment has his department made of the numbers of Palestinian children who will die as a direct result? And finally, does he not see that continuing to arm the IDF, this government places itself on the wrong side of history, and that history will judge it accordingly?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, he made 4 points, I think, which I'd like to address. The first thing is he talked about the importance of a ceasefire, and he should be very clear that we want to see an immediate humanitarian pause so that we can get the hostages out and humanitarian support in. leading then to a sustainable ceasefire. So I've explained the position, and that relates to his fourth point about how we ensure that this suffering ends and we manage to get the necessary humanitarian supplies into Gaza. He asked me about the ICJ, and as I set out in my statement, we respect the role and independence of the ICJ, and I pointed out they called for an increased aid into Gaza and measures to ensure basic services, and have also ensured that they order the immediate release of all hostages and reminded all parties to the conflict that they are bound by international humanitarian law. We agree with that, and it's extremely important that those points are respected. He asked me about the cutting of UNRWA funding. We're not cutting funding to UNRWA. We are pausing any future funding. There is no funding due. We've made the funding available. There is no funding due for the rest of this financial year, and clearly future funding will depend upon the result of the inquiries which are now in process.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICJ have rightly dismissed South Africa's obscene demand for Israel to stop defending its people and instructed Israel not to stop, but only to prevent genocide, which, of course, it's already doing. Meanwhile, Hamas have been ordered to release the hostages, which they haven't done. Now, South Africa, whose crime rate is totally out of control, has meanwhile banned David Teager, the young captain of the Under-19 Cricket World Cup, because he is Jewish. And is my right honourable friend concerned about the safety of Jews in South Africa in these circumstances, and will he consider changing Foreign Office advice about travel to South Africa?
Well, my right honourable friend, I believe absolutely rightly, points to the hideous nature of the charge against Israel of genocide, and I agree with him on that. On the subject he raises about the release of the hostages as something that everyone has been asking for, I have read the reports that have come out of the meetings that took place in France over the weekend. It's still not clear whether progress of a significant nature has been made, but we all very much hope that it has.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The right honourable gentleman mentions the issues of interim measures set out by the ICJ. Does he, and he's refused to answer my right honourable friend's question on this as well, the Shadow Secretary of State, Shadow Foreign Secretary, does he believe Israel has legal obligation to comply with the measures set out by the ICJ?
Well, the answer to that has been set out in the House on a number of occasions. Israel plans to act in accordance with IHL and, of course, has the ability to do so. And that is what the British government continually presses upon the Israeli government.
Who's Grayling?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all share the abhorrence of what happened in October, and this House has stood behind Israel in its right to defend itself. But this conflict that's lasted far too many decades will only be solved with a two-state solution and a proper humanitarian response led really by the Israeli government. Does he have confidence that that will happen? And if not, what else can we do to put pressure on our friends, the Israelis, to say this is the only way forward for you?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend makes an extremely good point. We and our allies and friends and virtually everyone in the region believes that the only answer to this is a two-state solution with Palestinians living behind safe borders and Israelis living behind safe borders as well. And that is the policy of the government, it's the policy of this House and the opposition, and we are pursuing it vigorously, as Lord Cameron showed in his many meetings last week.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Minister said the government didn't support the reference to the ICJ, but that it supports the outcome which justifies that reference. Given these mixed messages, what confidence can we have that the Minister is communicating to his Israeli counterpart that the legally binding orders of the court must be complied with?
Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've already set out the government's response to what the court said, but in response specifically to his question, he may rest assured that these points were made by the Foreign Secretary throughout his extensive trip in the region last week.
Vicky Ford.
A pause in fighting, humanitarian aid and a long-lasting peace. All of these are needed to stop people dying now and in the future. Thank you for setting out the 5-point plan towards that long-lasting peace. I find it so frustrating that people who may be pro-Israel say to me, there's no point talking about a two-state solution because the Palestinian people will never agree to it. People who may be a bit more pro-Palestine will say there's no point talking about a long-term a two-state solution because the Israeli government will never agree to it. So does he agree that everyone should stop second-guessing what others won't agree to and start working on saying what they will agree to and how we get there?
Well, my right honourable friend makes an extremely good point, and she will have noticed that those are exactly the tactics that the British government is employing. We are quite clear about the importance of the two-state solution, and we hope that when the political track is able to recommence, a moment that cannot come too soon, that everyone will bend their sinews to delivering that result.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. No one is disputing that Israel has the right to defend itself, but it must do so within the law, and that's what the ICJ has said. Now, when the ICJ ordered provisional measures in the case against Myanmar, the UK government welcomed the decision and asserted that Myanmar must do more, and I quote, to protect the Rohingya. And a government minister made a statement saying, "We encourage the government of Myanmar to comply with the provisional measures which are legally binding." So is the minister prepared to stand at the dispatch box and say the same of Israel? Does he encourage the government of Israel to comply with the provisional measures, and does he accept that they are legally binding?
Well, of course, as we've made clear, we always emphasise the importance of abiding by international humanitarian law. But at the start of her question, she set out the two key points that were made: the importance of international humanitarian law and the release of the hostages. Those are 2 points that were made by the court, and the government strongly approves of them.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When we talk about collective punishment, let's remember it's Hamas who have subjected the people of Gaza to collective punishment when they decided to steal aid and fuel meant for civilians, when they decided to embed their military capability in schools and in hospitals in civilian areas, and when they have made clear that they intend to continue attacking Israel in the way they did on October the 7th. Those are the people who have subjected Gazans to what is happening at the moment. In terms of UNRWA, intelligence reports on in the Wall Street Journal today suggests that 1,200 UNRWA staff are actual operatives of Hamas or other Palestinian terror groups. 23% of UNRWA's male employees took part in Hamas's military or political framework, and 49% of all UNRWA employees have family or relatives who belong to Hamas or other Gaza-based terror groups. Is that what the taxpayers of Brigham Gould should be having their money used for? To groups who want to murder not just all Jews in Israel, but all Jews in this country?
Minister.
Well, that is the reason why the government has paused future payments. But I should make it clear that in my discussion with Philip Lazzarini, who runs UNRWA this morning, I specifically welcome the fact that he is going to have a totally independent review so that the conclusions are unimpeachable. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, means discussions with the US State Department, including US congressional interests, with the EU and the UK, and including engaging respected individuals who might assist. Now, it is that quality of investigation that is now required to satisfy my honourable friend, but also many others across the House who are extremely concerned about this.
Roshanara Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Minister explain to the House what the impact of this review and the time it will take will actually have in terms of the aid that is provided to people? I recognise he's saying it won't be in the future, but it's really important we understand what the humanitarian impact will be of this change while the investigations happen. And can he, with his great record of campaigning against genocide and genocide prevention, can he address the point about how the UK government will speak to our Israeli counterparts to make sure it does follow the prevention order that is desperately needed, as has been highlighted by the ICJ case?
Minister.
Well, on the point about aid getting through, which I know she and I would for many years have shared a deep concern about that. We are temporarily pausing any future funding of UNRWA while we review these appalling allegations, but we are absolutely committed to ensuring that humanitarian aid gets into Gaza for the people who so desperately need it. That we do, of course, work with other organisations, the British Red Cross, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, which has been essential in bringing vital supplies from Jordan into Gaza. But the infrastructure, as I have mentioned in my response to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, the infrastructure which UNRWA has inside Gaza, that will always be fundamental to getting humanitarian relief to the people who need it.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I very much welcome the five-point plan, the call for immediate pause in fighting, and indeed the contact group of bringing together stakeholders. The allegations directed at UNRWA are indeed serious, and I think we should all welcome the investigation ordered by the UN Chief, Antonio Guterres. I understand why countries, including the UK, have paused funding, but given that UNRWA is the primary humanitarian agency in Gaza, would the Minister agree that holding back funds for too long could see the humanitarian situation degrade further and could see more Gazans joining the ranks of Hamas?
Minister.
My right honourable friend, the former Defence Chair of the Select Committee, is right to focus on that issue. And I spoke this morning also, Madam Deputy Speaker, to Sigrid Kaag, who is the Humanitarian Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. And she made clear to me that while we have zero tolerance of these dreadful things that are alleged to have been done, we cannot operate at zero risks. And the politics of logistics and distribution are a nightmare, as he knows, in Gaza. So we will look very carefully at these reports. We will suspend any future funding until we have them, but we recognise that the UNRWA assets are essential to delivering in Gaza.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The ICJ ruling is incredibly serious for all sides. But can the Minister tell us today, is it His Majesty's Government's analysis that Israel is operating within the measures that have been set out? And crucially, what consequences will there be if there is no observance of the ICJ's rulings? The Minister has told us for nearly 100 days now that we have been pressing for proportionate action in Gaza. We haven't got proportionate action in Gaza. So the question for the Minister must be, what are we now going to do differently to change behaviour on the ground?
Minister.
Well, I don't agree with the right honourable gentleman that we need to do things differently. We have been pressing very hard for these changes to be made, and my noble friend Lord Cameron, when he was in the region, tried to advance the various issues epitomised in the five-point plan, which we are trying to drive forward. He asked me specifically about the judgment on international humanitarian law. As I've said to the House before, we know that Israel plans to act in accordance with international humanitarian law and has the ability to do so. Clearly, these things are looked at all the time, but the judgments that we have made, which I set out to the House in the past, remain current today.
Sir Edward Lee.
Israel is much more than Prime Minister Netanyahu. What more are we doing in the US and the UK to encourage moderate voices in Israel who argue for a definite democratic future for Gaza and the West Bank? And above all, is there any more progress we can make in convincing the Israeli government that it's not in their interest to have any more settlements or any expansion of existing settlements? It's that sense of helplessness of the Palestinian people that's fueling this whole conflict. So what more pressure can we put on the Israeli government?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend accurately says that there is a plurality of opinion in Israel, and we strongly support and say within Israel what we think is the right way forward, which above all is a two-state solution. But I can tell him that during the course of our right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary's visits, he He was able, for example, to go and engage specifically with President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority and assure them that there is a plan to push forward at the point where certain changes are made in the way the Palestinian Authority is run, and that Britain will be there at their shoulder to assist when that moment comes.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICJ ruling is highly significant all around the world, despite the government's opposition to South Africa even taking the case there. A few days later, news comes out of the issues facing UNRWA. The UK government, the US government and others then announced they're withdrawing funding from it. Now, I understand the British government's payments are not due until April. Presumably the US government has suspended payments immediately. The immediate effect on the most desperate people in the world, that is the million people around Rafah trying to get something to eat, water to drink and medicines to be cured with, are not getting that support they desperately need. Has his government been in touch with the Israeli government to demand that they adhere to the ICJ ruling? And will he, in the light of the ICJ ruling, also tell us that all British military aid to Israel has been suspended until such time as they abide by the ruling?
The Right Honourable Gentleman will have seen the reports of the meetings that the Foreign Secretary had, including with Prime Minister Netanyahu last week during his series of regional visits. I can tell him, in respect of his penultimate point, that the Prime Minister spoke to President Biden on the 22nd of January, and he discussed with the President the UK and American shared view and deep concerns about the terrible suffering and loss of civilian life. I have nothing to add to what I have already said about the ICJ ruling, but he may rest assured that we are very focused on the extraordinary degree of suffering that is taking place in the area around Rafah, where so many people are effectively kettled without either shelter or food.
Desmond Swain.
Circumstances would change the policy of the government of Israel, which is currently determined to oppose a two-state solution.
Well, I think he reflects one strand of opinion in Israel, but he does not reflect the fact that there are many others, and there is not only inside Israel but all around the region and internationally and at the UN a very clear understanding that the two-state solution is the right answer. People may disagree about how you get there, but most people accept that that is the destination.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let us be in no doubt in this House. Article 1 of the Genocide Convention makes it absolutely clear the UK has a legal obligation, not just a moral duty, to act to prevent genocide. Yet, whilst the government are rightly fulfilling these obligations in part in Burma, they allowed arms sales to the Israeli military to continue despite the concerns of the Foreign Office's own legal advisers that the Israeli military's actions in Gaza were unlawful. Now that the ICJ's interim ruling agrees it is legally plausible under international law that a genocide is being committed in Gaza, possibly using arms sold by the UK, will the government immediately suspend the sale of arms to the Israeli military?
I must make clear to the Honourable Gentleman that his interpretation of what the ICJ is saying is not the government's interpretation, or indeed many members of the House. And may I also reiterate a point I made earlier, that the throwing across the chamber of accusations of genocide in respect of Israel's activities in Gaza are extraordinarily offensive and, in my view, totally wrong.
Flick Drummond.
Deputy Speaker, and the Foreign Secretary, writing in the Mail on Sunday on the 28th of January, stated how important it was to allow vital aid to get into Gaza, where people are starving and disease is spreading. Indeed, the provision of aid has been a key cornerstone of the UK's response to the current crisis in Gaza, as the Ministers outlined, with the 60 million in donated aid since the 7th of October. In the light of the recent decision to freeze funding to UNRWA, how will this aid be delivered? And following the review, what action is the UK expecting UNRWA to take to see the funding resumed?
Well, the action that UNRWA needs to take is pretty clear. They need to make sure that nothing like this can ever happen again. But I want to emphasise, in response to my honourable friend, that we are not cutting humanitarian supplies to UNRWA at this time. We have paid up the money that is required for UNRWA to continue. There is nothing planned until April. There wasn't before these terrible events. But we will review future funding in the light of the inquiry, which the Secretary-General will be receiving as swiftly as possible.
Seema Malhotra.
Madam Deputy Speaker, could I echo and support the words of my right honourable friend that international law must be upheld and the ICJ ruling implemented in full. If I could ask the Minister briefly about UNRWA further, which has done vital work since 1950 and supports refugees in the West Bank and Jordan as well as Gaza, educates 500,000 children, and he has referred to the stabilising effect that its work has had in a very conflict-driven region. So following the suspension of 12 staff and the condemnation of their actions, 12 staff of 13,000, could he just clarify this point about assurances that the government can give that UNRWA operations will continue while the investigations are taking place and that ordinary Gazans will still be accessing that vital aid?
Well, on the honourable lady's final point, the UNRWA humanitarian operations will not be fettered in any way by the British decision in terms of getting humanitarian aid to people who need it. She will be well aware that there are very significant logistical problems outside of that, but the effect of the decision that we have made about suspending future payments does not affect the payments that we have made already. And I recognise the importance which she attaches to getting more aid and support, humanitarian support into Gaza. That is the absolute intention of the British government.
Drew Hendry.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Minister is absolutely right to reference the desperate plight of civilians in Gaza. My constituent, Dr Salim Gayada, is an NHS surgeon of 20 years and a UK citizen and is terrified for his family who are trapped in Gaza. Unlike other governments, the UK government is offering no help to UK citizens with families stuck in Gaza. So will the government consider a scheme for non-citizens like the Ukraine scheme to help with this desperate situation, this plight for citizens in Gaza?
I have to tell the honourable gentleman that we have been working with partners to secure all those who wish to leave, including British nationals and their families. We've helped facilitate over 300 British nationals to leave Gaza, and we are working with Egyptian and Israeli authorities to ensure that any remaining British nationals who want to leave but haven't been able to do so previously can do so.
I do apologise. I will now call two from the government benches. Dr Matthew Offord.
Deputy Speaker. In November, a report by the Institute for Manifesting Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education reported that half of Gaza's 500,000 school pupils attended UNRWA-operated education institutions, and that the Palestinian Authority curriculum taught in these schools is replete with anti-Semitism and encourages violence. Now, the Minister says he's going to suspend future payments, but the damage has already been done by decades of UK funding.
I can tell my honourable friend that when I was previously in government, I heard these allegations back in 2010, 11, 12, and I asked to see and have translated these school books, and I have, in the last year, raised the same point again. I have not seen any evidence of what he is describing. If he would like to give the government evidence, we will, of course, follow it up. But I must make clear to him that both 10 years ago and in the last year, no such evidence has been forthcoming.
Bob Blackman.
Deputy Speaker, many of us on this side have had concerns about the activities of UNRWA and the people that work for it. Now that it's been exposed by an excellent question from my honourable friend, member for Brigg and Gould, about the numbers of UNRWA employees who are directly linked to terrorist organisations, what confidence can we have that the aid that we are providing actually gets to the people that need it, rather than being diverted by the terrorists that exist in Gaza? And if all these people are actually involved from UNRWA
with the terrorist organisations, perhaps they could actually do something about assisting to get the hostages out of captivity.
Well said.
Well, he is absolutely right to make clear that getting the hostages out is absolutely essential. I mean, he refers to the 12 people who have been identified out of a workforce of 13,000. I can tell him that the head of UNRWA told me this morning that of the 12, 2 are dead and 1 is mismatched. So we're talking here about 9 people, but nevertheless, he makes the right point about the fact that this is completely intolerable. And as a result of the inquiries that have been set up, both within UNRWA, but the more widely held one that I described in my opening remarks, we will wait and see what comes out of those inquiries, and then we will make our plans accordingly.
Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In answering the honourable member for Melton Mowbray, and in a number of the answers that the Minister has given today, he said, we have raised this with Israel, as if that's enough, like we've raised it. What did Israel say in response to the question that was put by the member for Melton Mowbray about a humanitarian base, known humanitarian base, being bombed? And what will the government do to insist that Israel abide by the ICJ's ruling that it investigate and punish direct public incitement to genocide? Will we just raise it?
The conversations that take place, because Britain is a close ally and friend of many in the region, but of Israel in particular, we are able to have difficult conversations, and it is perfectly clear that both the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister have done so with the President of Israel, the Prime Minister, and with large numbers of members of their cabinet. So those discussions, seeking to persuade them to accept the need for a vast increase in humanitarian support getting into Gaza, moving forward towards a political track, those are the ambitions and views of the British government, and we are able, through this close relationship, to press them at all levels of Israeli society.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the move to pause UNRWA funding, but I think the scale of the problem is much more significant than a handful of people, given the reports that there are in fact 10% of UNRWA's 12,000 workers in Gaza somehow linked to Hamas and other terror groups. But given a few weeks ago, it was revealed that a Telegram group used by 3,000 UNRWA teachers celebrated the 7th of October massacre. Why, given these appalling earlier revelations, did the government not rethink our relationship with UNRWA before?
Well, those allegations are, as my honourable friend makes clear, abhorrent. And we have always been aware that there are dangers in operating in the environment in Gaza. That is why this is one of the most inspected and scrubbed development and aid programmes that Britain has anywhere in the world. But I hope that he will be reassured by what I said earlier in response to one of our honourable friends about the independence of the inquiry that is taking place, the fact that it will add to its number respected independent people who will hopefully be able to give a useful judgment, and also engage both in the EU and in the UK and on the Hill in America to make sure that we move to a better position.
John McDonnell.
Has the Minister seen the reaction to the ICJ judgment in Israel, the reports of the weekend, where there are a number of rallies where Netanyahu cabinet members were saying the ICJ make judgments, but we make settlements, and the call for settlements in Gaza now, both in Khan Yunis and Rafah, and at the same time Netanyahu himself was attacking the Qataris, even though actually for most aspects they've been playing a role which has been significant in securing the release of hostages, and at the same time has also been refusing to engage in a discussion with regard to the Egyptian peace programme. The reality is the UK government has virtually no influence over Netanyahu, and we should admit it. The only ones he'll listen to are the Americans. So what discussions are we having now with the Biden administration to ensure they maximise the pressure to bring about a ceasefire discussion and the release of the hostages and the release of prisoners?
Well, first of all, he will know that the British government condemns the building of these settlements, and he will also have heard what I and others have said about the complete condemnation of settler violence and the demand that the Israeli government held to account those responsible for it, put them before the courts and punish them. In respect of the Qataris, I will be in Qatar at the end of next week. I pay tribute to the work that Qatar has been doing, in particular on trying to assist with getting the hostages out. And in respect of authoritative voices in Israel, I would point him to the meetings that the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, had with Netanyahu. They've known each other for many years. The Foreign Secretary was able to deliver some tough messages during that meeting, and I believe those messages will be heard.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The reports of UNRWA staff potentially being involved in the 7th of October massacres, one of the worst pogroms against Jewish people since the Holocaust, brings horror to many people, and especially now we're learning that up to 10% of UNRWA employees have got some links to Hamas. Now, I know the Minister has said there's going to be independent review into UNRWA. Can you give me assurance that it will be independent, the UK government will actually have an input in that to make sure the UN isn't marking its own homework, and if these allegations are all true, what are we going to do about UNRWA? Because you cannot continue spending taxpayers' money to fund anti-Semitic terror attacks.
The review will not be a case of UNRWA marking its own homework, and they have specifically accepted that it must be a different part within the United Nations, far away from UNRWA, that will be making these judgments. But we will look very carefully at what these inquiries reveal. I'm completely with him on ensuring that nothing like this can happen again, and I hope the independence that is being injected into these inquiries will give him some confidence that we are moving to a different place.
Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As others have said, the ICJ's interim ruling could not be more serious, and it sets out urgent provisional measures which must be followed. I am sorry, but the Minister hasn't yet been clear on this point, so I am going to ask again. Does the government agree that Israel has a legal obligation to comply with those measures? And what role will the government be playing in ensuring that Israel does submit a report to the court on the steps it has taken to comply with the orders within 1 month of the ruling, as it is now required to do so?
Well, I think I have answered the point that she makes about the ICJ, but let me reiterate once again that we regularly call on Israel to uphold its obligations under international humanitarian law, and in all circumstances we will continue to do so.
Richard Fuller.
Speaker, the allegations against those employees of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency were appalling, but UNRWA remains a vital source of food and support for the Palestinian people. I can already hear on our own backbenches voices that seem to be looking to throttle that funding for UNRWA for the long term. Can my right honourable friend advise us what is going to happen between now and April with regard to his representations to the Chancellor regarding the budget and the contingency funding for this organisation after April?
Well, we will make, Madam Deputy Speaker, our plans known to the House in the usual way for funding, but we cannot do so until we have seen the report and are clear that what has been revealed cannot happen again. But let me emphasise to my honourable friends, it is the UNRWA infrastructure inside Gaza, the warehouses, the vehicles, the stores, the identity system, the ID system, and the UNRWA ID system, which is used by the Israeli government. Those infrastructure assets will have to be used, regardless of who uses them, and they are UNRWA assets.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What steps is the government taking in line with its own obligations under international law to ensure the full and immediate implementation of provisional measures ordered by the ICJ regarding the protection of Palestinians from genocide and the immediate provision of humanitarian aid and other vital services? And can he confirm whether the UK will now be ending arms sales to Israel due to the risk that they could be used unlawfully to kill women and children?
Well, we keep We keep all arms exports under review. She will know that we have one of the tightest regimes in the world. Clearly, we consider any impact from the court's ruling. And in respect of the other points she made, she'll have heard what I've said about the ICJ ruling, and indeed what I've said about throwing allegations of genocide across the House.
Steve Dovell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend for his update of the House after what have been a number of very significant and concerning developments in recent days. But the one thing none of us should forget in the midst of all this is that there continue to be dozens and dozens of families who every day live with the anguish of knowing that one of their loved ones is being held hostage in conditions that they don't know their whereabouts, their well-being, or the conditions that they're being held in. So shouldn't the one thing that every member of this House be calling from the ICJ report is the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas?
My honourable friend is absolutely correct. He sets out the government's position on the release of hostages, and I had the deeply moving task of attending a meeting with my right honourable friend from Northampton North, where I heard firsthand about the awful plight of the hostages. And my honourable friend may rest assured that the British government, working with partners, will do everything it can to secure their release as swiftly as possible.
Graham Morris.
Thank you. The Deputy Foreign Secretary, his honourable friend, the member for Melton Mowbray, raised the dreadful, appalling issue of the targeted Israeli airstrike on the MAP compound, the British charity in Gaza. On behalf of the NUJ and the International Federation of Journalists, can I raise with the Deputy Foreign Secretary the fact that almost 100 journalists have been killed in Gaza since the 7th of October. Their bravery has kept the world informed and exposed some of these appalling atrocities that we see daily. Can I ask, what does the Minister plan to do to stop the deliberate targeting of journalists? Can I remind them that the ICJ ruling particularly says the provisional measures, we must continue collecting evidence of breaches? Thank you.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments. He will know that this government, and in particular through the work of the Foreign Office, has done its best to stand up for the right of journalistic integrity, for the right of journalists to be able to report on circumstances like this. So I very strongly agree with what he said about that. In respect of the particular bombing to which he referred, may I draw his attention to what I said earlier about the fact that this has been raised by the British government, and as soon as practical, it was raised by the ambassador in Tel Aviv.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has spoken at length about the relationship that this country has with Israel and the powerful networks of advocacy that could be put towards that noble cause of securing a ceasefire and, indeed, a safe Israel and a free Palestine. So let's see if he will use them today. Will he be clear that this government and its next conversations with the Israeli government will be condemning those far-right Israeli ministers who attended the conference this weekend in Jerusalem about the resettlement of Gaza? There were members of Likud, including the National Security Minister, who said that Israelis need to find a legal way to voluntarily emigrate Palestinians. And will he confirm that the UK will support the reported brokered deal by Israel, US, Egypt and Qatar for the immediate release of the remaining Hamas hostages? How will this government use our voice?
On her final point, of course, we are working very closely with the Qataris and the administration of the United States to effect the release of the hostages. And while I can't give a running commentary across the House, she may rest assured that we are intimately engaged with that. She talks about our effect and reach within Israel, but it's not just within Israel, it's within all the region. The British diplomatic service has an unparalleled reach in terms of talking about the way ahead and the political track, and we are exercising that. And in respect of the rallies that took place on the weekend and the reports that she has just raised, those are not the policies of the British government.
Chris Lowe.
Madam Deputy Speaker, given mounting reports of evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Israel, and now serious recognition by the ICJ of the real risk of genocide, Does the UK Government accept the provision of weapons may lead to complicity in such a crime, and will they therefore immediately cease the licensing of arms and security equipment to Israel?
Well, the honourable gentleman will know that Britain has one of the most effective and tough arms sale regulation authorities in the world. And he may rest assured that the provisions of that do not alter when dealing with Israel or any other country.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The International Court of Justice is the world's top court, a leading body of the United Nations, and its orders are binding. It's called on Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent the killing or causing of serious harm to people in Gaza. Yet hundreds more people in Gaza have been killed since Friday's ruling. As a signatory to the ICJ, doesn't the government now have a legal as well as a moral duty to uphold the ICJ and not undermine its rulings, and to do much more to stop Israel's actions in Gaza? And shouldn't that include suspending arms sales to Israel?
Well, on his final point, I've set out the position on arms sales and the regime which the British government set up and supports. And on his points about the ICJ, I think I've set out the government's position very clearly on that, and I have nothing to add to what I've said already.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm increasingly worried about the trend of this government to for the casual acceptance of international law and international courts when it suits. This is just not good enough. It really isn't. But on the ICJ interim ruling, I just want to point out that under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, the CJ pointed out that this must be upheld, including ensuring the provision of humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. So given what the Minister has said about UNRWA, and that it is the largest humanitarian agency in there, if the UK decides, and other donors decide, that they're going to cease not just the pause, but completely, permanently, how is the government and other international donors going to ensure the same capacity of humanitarian relief? And if they don't, are they in contempt of the ICJ ruling?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not able to answer any of her legal points, nor should I across the House. But what I can assure her is that we are absolutely committed to making sure that international relief, humanitarian supplies get into Gaza. It is the burden of much of the discussion and comment that the British government is engaged in. I discussed it with Jamie McGoldrick and indeed with Martin Griffiths, the head of OCHA, over the weekend. We are doing everything we can to expand the ability to get aid into Gaza. And when it comes to UNRWA, she will know that while we have made it clear we will not be making any further payments until these inquiries are completed to our satisfaction, nevertheless, the funding which we have already given to UNRWA is having an effect on the ground. We just wanted to make sure that it reaches the people for which it is intended.
Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you. Earlier, Minister failed to answer the question put to him by my honourable friend from Bradford East, so I ask him similar question and give him another opportunity to answer the question. Given the ICJ's interim ruling that the risk of genocide in Gaza is plausible, will the Minister suspend UK arms sales to Israel to ensure that the UK weapons are not used to kill innocent Palestinians?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the subject of arms sales and on the subject of the ICJ, I have set out for him the government's position, and I'm afraid just because he asks the same question again does not mean he's going to get a different answer.
Hal Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 2 months ago, I asked the government if they would consider providing specialist treatment for the wounded children of Gaza in UK hospitals, as is often done when there is a natural disaster or a cruel war abroad. The Minister at the time responded saying that the choice was in fact to increase in-country aid, and he referred himself to, of course, the increase of £16 million in his statement. But given the destruction of hospitals in Gaza and the dire state of medical facilities. Will he reconsider that stance?
Hear, hear.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are considering whether we should join with the UAE, who are lifting people out of Gaza, children particularly, and giving them support in the UAE. And he will also know that we have deployed an emergency medical team who are looking at the situation there. We would, if it was appropriate, deploy a field hospital. Indeed, we would deploy it into Gaza if it was practical and appropriate. So on the critical subject that he raises about trying to ensure that we help all those who are hurt and wounded, and in particular children, he may rest assured that we are looking at all aspects of that.
Wayne.
Thank you. We talk about statistics as though they're not human lives. 26,000 men, women and children killed. 1.9 million people that have been displaced. A human catastrophe engulfing the people of Gaza. Look, the 5-point plan is great. We know what needs to be done. The fighting has to stop. The aid has to get in. The hostages need releasing, and we need to rebuild both the civilian infrastructure and hope for the Palestinians. But there's one roadblock to a Palestinian state, and that's Prime Minister Netanyahu and those allies in government around him. They don't want Judea and Samaria handing over to the Palestinians for a state. They want the resettlement of Gaza. So on his visit to see the Prime Minister of Israel, did the Foreign Secretary tell Mr Netanyahu his views on the creation of a state of Palestine and indeed on a second Nakba are not just unacceptable and wrong, they are abhorrent?
The honourable gentleman made the point about the numbers as statistics, but those numbers speak for themselves, and there'll be no one in the House who doesn't reflect upon the catastrophe that has engulfed Gaza. And he then went on to set out a very eloquent roadmap for moving forward and for progress. He asks me about the Foreign Secretary's discussion with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I think that is a matter for either Prime Minister Netanyahu or the Foreign Secretary to reveal, but I can assure him that the Foreign Secretary would have been his usual robust self in setting out the position of the British government. And in respect of the blockage, as he put it, to the ceasefire and to progress being Prime Minister Netanyahu, I would point out to him that Hamas have made it clear that they're not interested in a ceasefire. What they want to see is a repeat of the appalling events that took place on October the 7th.
Lord Ewell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. According to Euromed Human Rights Monitor, in just 2 days since the International Court of Justice ruling, at least 373 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli bombings and airstrikes, including 345 civilians, and 643 others have been seriously injured and wounded. Israel is already in breach of the order. What action is the government taking to prevent the killing of Palestinians in Gaza, and will it now stop arming Israel, call for an immediate ceasefire, and stop allowing Israel to act with impunity? And will the Minister let this House know what legal advice he has sought or the government has received in relation to ensuring that the UK is not complicit in acts of genocide?
Well, the Honourable Lady sets out with great eloquence the jeopardy and difficulties which are facing the people of Gaza at this time. And I hope it is a matter of reassurance and comfort to her that the government also recognises how difficult this situation and is doing everything it possibly can to help move onto a political track and end the great difficulties which she set out.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICJ's ruling is clear and specific, and respect for the International Court is of the utmost importance. Yet in response, the Minister seems simply to be saying that it is business as usual. So can I press him again? What steps is the government taking to ensure that the provisional measures ordered by the ICJ are complied with in full? And what does he believe should be done to ensure accountability?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe that it's essential there is an immediate humanitarian pause to get aid in, get the hostages out, that Hamas must agree to the release of all hostages, that Hamas can no longer be in charge of Gaza, and an agreement must be in place for the Palestinian authorities to return to Gaza in order to provide governance, services and security. That is the way in which we make progress, and that is the commitment and policy of the British Government.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister referred earlier to the extraordinary degree of suffering in Gaza, and we need an immediate ceasefire to stop that humanitarian disaster, to get the aid in now. But such has been the destruction, the level of destruction in Gaza, that need for aid work will continue for many months and many years. So when the Minister spoke to Philippe Lazzarini earlier on, did Mr Lazzarini indicate, firstly, how long this inquiry is likely to take, but secondly, how long it would be before the pause in funding starts to impact on the agency's humanitarian aid work?
Well, Philippe Lazzarini didn't indicate a specific timeline, but I would be very surprised if it couldn't be completed within the next 2 months. And it is essential that it is, because we and others need to make our plans to fund humanitarian relief. And in making those plans, we will need to decide what we're going to do about UNRWA.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is reported that the heads of the CIA, Mossad, Egyptian intelligence and the Qatari Prime Minister have agreed on a new hostage deal framework to put to Hamas. The deal would reportedly include the release of remaining American and Israeli hostages in phases, starting with women and children, in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. So, can the Minister inform the House if the UK were involved at all in negotiating this framework, and also if the government are using their diplomatic position to press for the release of all the hostages as soon as possible?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the British Government is very strongly in support of the process which she described and which was taking place in France over the weekend. I have heard the reports on the media about this, but I'm not in a position to update the House authoritatively on its results at this point.
Manjit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will have seen the harrowing ITV News interview and subsequent video of an innocent Palestinian civilian brandishing a white flag in a so-called Gaza safe zone as he was shot dead in cold blood by the Israeli army. Does the Minister think that that constitutes a war crime, and what representations has the UK government made to the Israeli government about it?
Well, first of all, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have seen many videos of that sort, and my reaction is the same as the Honourable Gentleman's. But I can tell him that in terms of what the British government is doing, as I've set out throughout this statement, we are intent on trying to help ensure that the situation is brought to a conclusion as rapidly as possible, and in the meanwhile that we get aid and humanitarian support into Gaza to help those who are suffering so grievously there.
Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The International Court of Justice ruling that it is plausible that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza should have been the moment that this government suspended arms sales to Israel and finally called for an immediate end to Israel's bombardment of Gaza. But instead, this government is stopping its funding for the UN aid agency that millions of Palestinians rely on. These recent allegations must be investigated, but this decision collectively punishes the Palestinian people and will lead to more starvation. So in light of the ICJ ruling, I asked the Minister what legal advice has he had which says continuing to arm Israel while stopping funding for Gaza's primary aid agency is consistent with the government's obligation under the Genocide Convention.
First of all, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are not stopping funding UNRWA. We are not committing any future funds. Britain has been funding, is funding UNRWA today, but we are not willing in these circumstances, until these inquiries have been completed, to pledge any additional funds to UNRWA at this time. And in respect of her interpretation of the ICJ ruling, I must reiterate what I've already said, that understanding is not the understanding of the British government.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Minister's statement is silent on the West Bank, so he'll be aware of reports of increased settler violence, forcing shepherds from their land, the confiscation of livestock, imposing fuel blockades and the arrest of Palestinian civilians who are being placed under administrative detention. That's indefinite detention without charge. So can I ask him what assessment and representations he's making on these serious reports that keep coming out of the West Bank?
He will have seen, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the British Government has condemned, without qualification, settler violence and illegal acts that have taken place on the West Bank, and has also made it absolutely clear that when these acts take place, those who make them must be held to account, put before the courts and punished. In respect of the overall situation on the West Bank, I can tell him that Lord Cameron was there last week, had some extremely good meetings, not just with President Abbas, but with others also in the Palestinian Authority, and sketched out a way in which Britain can be by their side and helping them when a political track is possible, and that they should make the necessary reforms first before that political track comes available, so that they are ready to go when it does.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On Friday, the ICG determined that there may be plausible ground for Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians of Gaza. Now, with that in mind, and with the case ongoing, will the Minister confirm it will take the only serious options available to separate itself from the risk of complicity, and that is to demand an immediate ceasefire, immediately ban all sales of arms to Israel, including the ending of assistance and the transfer of any arms to Israel, including via the Akrotiri base in Cyprus, and ensure that sufficient funding is provided so that humanitarian aid reaches those people in desperate need.
Well, the Honourable Lady will understand that the issue is not providing the aid, it's getting it in. And it is, there is plenty of aid ready to go into Gaza. It's getting it in there, which is the most important. She will have heard what I've said about the arms regime which Britain has. And finally, she demands a ceasefire. The British government has set out very clearly that we want to see a humanitarian pause, we want to see the hostages freed, we want to see aid getting into Gaza, and then we want to see a sustained ceasefire. But I draw her attention to my earlier comments that that is not something which Hamas wants to see. So the policy of the British government will pursue the pause, getting the hostages back, and a sustainable ceasefire with every sinew that we can bring to bear.
I thank the Minister for his statement.